Greetings, students. I hope this video finds you doing well. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about critical race theory. If you've been following the news, you can see that there's a lot of rhetoric going on about this particular category, critical race theory, and it has polarized different parts of our country in terms of how we move forward. So my attempt today is to really supplement your readings to really help you understand a little bit more about critical race theory and actually what it is. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. So critical race theory basically is this movement that has been in place for quite some time by a number of activists and scholars who were, and this comes kind of at the educational place as well as law. They were really studying the relationship between race, racism, and power. And then it also examines these dynamics in a broader perspective in terms of economics, history of groups, and self-interest. So basically, it's looking at all of those particular dynamics in terms of how we look at how the world around us works, our society, what rules are in place, what policies drive things from an economic perspective, educational, religious, whatever the case may be. And it really looks at it through this lens of race. And so seeing that there is a difference depending on where you are and what your race is in terms of how you fare in our system. So it's a theory that has been in place for a while. So some of the basic tenets of CRT or critical race theory is simply this, is that one, the notion that racism is simply normal and ordinary. It's not an extraordinary, it's not an aberrant kind of thing. It's not something that's unusual or that happens on occasion. It's a part of our actual American society. So just to be clear with that piece. And the other tenet is that there's the notion of interest conversion. So when we look at various decisions, various institutions, various rules, groups, laws, and how they're structured, oftentimes what we find is upon further investigation that it advances the material and physical and psychological issues for whites. So in other words, things are done, and we'll talk more about this in a later slide where I'll give you a clear example of what we're talking about. But again, this whole notion of interest conversion that advances these particular things for members of our society who are white. One, it also connotes that social construction of race was established to do a hierarchy and assign worth and value to individuals. So this is a process that has been around, invented by our European brothers and sisters many years ago to categorize people into certain categories. And obviously, since they created the particular characterization process, then they placed themselves at the top of the list. No surprise there. And then as people of color from different parts of the world were put in this hierarchy, they were at a lower level. And that continues to be true to this day. That CRT actually indicates that the unique voices of color and different histories of oppression are just kind of not there. So when we look at textbooks, when we look at media, when we look at the portrayal of history, whose eyes is it being told through? Is it accurate? Is it what actually happened, or is it some different version? So again, there's some value sometimes in not, for those of us who may be white, there's value in not telling the full story in terms of that oppression piece that's there. And then we have the structural determinism, which is this unconscious, intentional, biological, environmental way that policies, procedures, our ways of being actually discriminate against people who are the communities of color. And then the critique of liberalism, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple later slides. So let's talk about interest convergence for a moment. Now, most of us have studied the whole notion of Brown versus Board of Education. And in 1954, segregation was ended and separate but equal was stricken down. So now, to give you a little bit of history in terms of this particular piece of legislation, is that the Supreme Court had been this particular issue had been brought up to the Supreme Court on a number of previous occasions. And it was always the same, that it was struck down and schools were still segregated. And then all of a sudden in 1954, the Supreme Court had a change of heart and decided to do things differently. So Derek Bell and some of the other folks who were the leaders in developing the critical race theory movement found that to be a little bit suspect and made the assertion that this was a rigged deal. That this whole piece of Brown versus Board of Education and the subtle reversal had much more to do with the interests of those in our country who are white than they did those who were actually people of color. So what does that look like? So basically, here's what was happening. People were coming back from World War II, and we had veterans who were veterans of color or soldiers of color who were coming back to a country that denied them voting rights, that had them sitting at the back of the bus, that would not get them housing, would not get them access to adequate employment after they had proven themselves in the theater of war in other countries defending this particular country. So America in the 50s, 40s was in the business also of looking at spreading democracy or the democratic process throughout the entire world. So the powers that be recognize that if we end up in a situation where we have people who have fought and died for our country, who happen to be people of color, and then they come back to a land where they are subjugated to be second-class citizens, that's not going to fly well for the spread of democracy around the world. And ironically, 1954, the Supreme Court changed its tune. So that's just an example of interest conversion. So on the surface, it looks like it was a move that was designed to improve the educational experiences of communities of color, but it was really supporting a political agenda of a nation that has a desire to spread democracy throughout the world and not look bad while they were doing it. So again, it's those things I think that are fairly interesting that history doesn't really spend a lot of time talking about. We also have this revisionist history notion that's a part of CRT, in that, can we trust what was written in our history books as actually being accurate? Or does it even at any point in time speak to what the experiences for those people of color were as it relates to that? The genocide of our Native American brothers and sisters, that's been told through the eyes of someone else. But I can imagine that if we think about learning those experiences from the people who actually suffered them, you probably have a little bit of a different, much more dramatic and probably much more accurate picture of actually what did take place. So that's just an example. This whole critique of liberalism, which addresses racial laws through colorblindness. So, if you notice, the statue of justice is this blindfolded lady with a scale in her hand, and that's kind of the idea. So the laws technically and policies should be neutral or colorblind as it relates to the principles of constitutional law. However, that doesn't always ring true when we start to think about looking at what's happening in our legal and criminal justice systems in terms of the disproportionality at which communities of color are actually incarcerated compared to how they show up in the actual population. So that says, to some level, this whole critique of liberalism and this whole colorblindness piece doesn't necessarily hold water. For an example, Supreme Court holds that it's wrong for the law to take note of race, even to remedy a historical wrong. So slavery, genocide, the war that took Mexico, or the western part of the United States from Mexico, was it a wrong thing? Was it a right thing? Or is it just, our society decided that, we're just not going to really mention race in that, because what good does it do? So again, it just gives you an idea of what we are looking at when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education. So, or should I say critical race theory. So as we go back to this whole notion of Brown versus Board of Education, um, if we look at our current school systems across this country, even though this was something that happened in 1954, schools were integrated in the 60s and the 70s. I'm a product of an integrated school system myself. If we were to take a look at where we are today as it relates to schools, what you'll find is that schools are actually as segregated as they have ever been, if not even more so, despite this particular ruling. All right. So as we move forward, sorry about that phone call. Um, we also have the notion of legal storytelling. So it's about counter storytelling. So it's about really getting the perspective of what transpired for a group of people accurately done through the eyes of those who actually lived and experienced it. And one of the um, greatest examples of that legal storytelling was Roots. This is the Alex Haley documentary. He did tons of research, really tracing his family roots back from the days of slavery all the way back to Africa to present day. And it gave America for the first time a very um, drastic and vivid and accurate portrayal of what it meant to be a slave in this country for the hundreds of years that people were enslaved. Um, and you won't find that in any mainstream textbooks or any other things, but it had to come through the eyes of people who were part of that culture, who experienced that, to make sure that it was done in an accurate way. Also, that the whole notion of intersectionality, which is the concept that all oppression is linked. So, if we start to think about, the rights of women, if we start to think about racial discrimination, if we think about economic class, national origin, sexual orientation, there's this intersecting piece that happens for particular people who subscribe to those particular ways of life and being. And so they're opened up to different forms of oppression and discrimination based on the rules, laws, policy, and statutes that are just a part of our system. So we need to understand that oppression doesn't happen in isolation. It happens often in conjunction with folks as well. And so really understanding that particular notion is going to be very, very important. So that's a brief kind of overview of critical race theory. A couple of questions in your final policy analysis will relate back to critical race theory, and your analysis of that particular policy through that lens is a part of what you'll be doing. So there's another short video here that's in this particular section that kind of walks again through critical race theory and provides some examples of how it actually manifests itself. So I would encourage you all to do your course readings, to take good notes, and to make sure that if you have any questions, to keep them for us, so when we get together via our Zoom labs, we can have much more conversation about critical race theory. Take care.